get back on their feet and supports a bold future for all. As Governor DeWine acknowledged earlier this week, many Ohioans continue to struggle. We were disappointed to see provisions that derail the Medicaid procurement process, pass on funding for critical broadband infrastructure, jeopardize quality childcare, and divert critical funding for public programs and community services to pay for tax cuts, remain in the bill and were passed by the Senate earlier this week. Our voices were neither heard nor heeded. We were further discouraged by the addition of policies that add costly red tape and discourage work and will increase hunger for children, families, older adults, and veterans. Despite months of advocacy, stakeholder meetings, and more than 60 organizations and individual opponents testifying against Senate Bill 17 in committee, harmful SNAP eligibility provisions and costly, burdensome administrative barriers were slipped into the state budget bill at the buzzer. As you will hear from our speakers today, these provisions will make it harder for people to access help when they need it, discourage work, and deepen the benefit cliff by forcing people to turn down employment or promotions in order to maintain benefits. They will force low-income Ohioans to choose between having food and owning a car to get to work, or saving money to prepare for an emergency. These provisions will also be incredibly costly for county agencies to implement, violate federal regulations, and increase the risk of federal penalties. These provisions come at a time when the pending eviction moratorium is ending, along with the loss of the $120 million a month in SNAP emergency allotments and the $300 per week unemployment benefits, all expiring at the end of this month. This could be a train wreck of epic proportion of more hunger, homelessness, and suffering for Ohioans across the state. We ask leaders of the House and Senate to remove provisions of the comparison document, section JFF 69, SNAP eligibility requirements from the budget in conference committee. Thank you again for your time today. I'd like to introduce Jack Freck, a former county JFS director. Thanks for joining us, Jack.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come up and address this issue. I've been doing this for a long time. I started as a welfare caseworker 48 years ago and have seen a lot of changes come in this system. And I need to tell you, to set the stage for this, before COVID hit, before that disaster hit, life for poor people was the worst I have seen it in my entire career of working in the public assistance system. Before COVID hit, we had more families who were doubled and tripled up in housing. We had more people who had no income. We had more people who were unhealthy. Every indicator we have in our communities, including children failing in school, children's health getting worse, all those things have been exacerbated, made worse by our failure to provide an adequate safety net to make sure people's basic needs are met. That was all going on before COVID hit. I think people have really very little idea when people start talking about adding more regulations to welfare, how complicated and difficult it is right now and has been for years for people to get assistance. It is a very complicated process. I have frequently opined that it's easier to get a national security clearance than it is to get $300 out of the state of Ohio. The truth of the matter is that when people apply for public assistance, we need to have a social security number for every member of their household. We verify everything they tell us, including their address, including the divorce papers they have, and the document, property they own. All of those things are verified. We take those social security numbers and rerun them against databases, unemployment, social security, IRS documents, new hires, a wide range of those things, plus having access to even private banking records and all kinds of things. All of those things are all the process that we put people through in order to give them a few $100s a month in public assistance, and they have been in place now for decades. The fraud rate for public assistance, the error rate is about 5 or 6% for food stamps. A half of that are errors made by the staff already, because it is a very complicated process. So we're talking a very small error rate. In response to this, it surprises me that at the same time we are choosing to deregulate businesses. We're choosing to deregulate now nursing homes. We're choosing to deregulate public health. At the same time, we are choosing to hyper-regulate poverty and poor people. The same people who don't believe in excessive government regulations somehow embrace it much more fully when it comes to public assistance policy and the kind of things they're talking about now. Are going to put the mean back in the means testing. So that kind of sets the stage, and I think the only other thing I would add to that is that if you were really going to address the issue of problems in food stamps, you would start with the fact that food stamp benefits are only entitled to meet a portion of your food needs, 75% if you're getting the full benefits. They're inadequate. That's one of the problems. And the other, of course, is that 20% of the people on food stamps, 20%, 1 out of 5, have no cash income whatsoever. Those are the problems with the food stamp program. Those are the ones that need to be addressed. Instead, what we're doing is basically reinstating many policies that have been used in the past and disregarded as being inefficient or counterproductive. One of those changes, of course, has to do with reporting, requiring change reporting. Truth of the matter is most people who are on food stamps, obviously they're already low income, they're working in low wage jobs. They have a lot of change in their income. Their work schedules change. Some of them are working more than one job. They have lots of changes. There was a time, and when I was around still, but we tried to keep up with every one of those changes. And if their income would drop by $50, we try to adjust their food stamps. If it went up by 50, we try to cut it every month. We were so incredibly overwhelmed with trying to do that and so far behind that essentially what it did is it drove up the error rate. Ohio and every other state who had that kind of change reporting requirement had very, very high excessive error rates because we couldn't possibly keep up with that many changes. So Ohio, and this is under, I believe, both the Republican and Democratic administrations, have embraced the idea that rather than do that, we do those adjustments on a quarterly or semi-annual basis, knowing that in general, most of these folks still are poor, very poor. And in fact, there is still a requirement that if their income gets to the point where it exceeds their eligibility, then we remove them immediately. I mean, there are plenty of safeguards in place, but the reality is in terms of the kind of jobs these folks have and keeping up that reporting, all it really does is create a lot more work and doesn't produce any benefit for anyone. One of the other options that we're concerned about, of course, is the whole idea of reinstating an asset test. $2,250. This would be particularly a problem for people who have vehicles. The problem with poor people with vehicles is they don't have them. They don't have enough of them. They can't afford them. The AAA and the IRS both agree the cost of operating a car is somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 a year. When you're making $20,000 a year, you can't afford that very easily. So as a result, poor people have a hard time keeping a car on the road. Anyone who works with poor people, that this is one of the biggest problems you have. How do you get them to services? And of course, the more specific consequences of a program like this is when you take away people's vehicles, they have no way to look for a job or find a job or go to school. In my time here, we absolutely did have a policy like this in the past, and that's exactly what happened. We took away people's functional vehicles. We left them without a vehicle or with a vehicle that was so dilapidated they couldn't keep it on the road anymore. We were essentially part of the assets test policy is looking at any other assets they have. We were also seizing burial accounts for old people. Those were the kind of things that will be reinstated if we adopt this policy. It is totally counterproductive. It drives up the cost of things like Medicaid transportation, which we have to pay for, all kinds of other programs. We end up having to provide transportation for low-income people. And the other thing I would add on this is that we have a problem even with food pantries, where people are showing up at the food pantry, and because their neighbors don't have vehicles, they'll have 2 or 3 family members in the car coming to pick up food. They don't have enough room for the food because the people who don't have cars have to share a ride. So that's bad. The other policy they want to implement is child support, mandated child support cooperation for SNAP benefits. This policy already exists for cash assistance. There's a direct connection for funds that are collected through child support, help offset the cost of the cash assistance program in Canada. There is no such connection like that with SNAP. I can tell you that this is very harmful for people who are in domestic violence situations. We essentially are forcing their hand, whereas many of these folks are trying very hard to stay away from people who are threatening them, and this forces them frequently to end up having contact with people they don't wish to have contact with or shouldn't. That's a problem. The other issue about collecting third-party data for Medicaid and doing this essentially a desk review of all the eligibility. What we will need people for, and caseworkers time for, after we shut off the declared emergency and people lose their unemployment benefits, people lose all their extra benefits, there will be more people applying for Medicaid. We will have a wave of people who will now be eligible for Medicaid who are not. And caseworkers' time is not going to be spent on that, rather than going through this desk. I guess just to wrap it up, I've seen this happen time and time again, where people, they take advantage of the myths. They think that people on public assistance are lying and cheating, which they're not. They think that people don't want to work, which they do want to work. All those things, they take the myths that people want to believe out there, and they regulate toward that. So, I think this is a terrible idea. They should not do these things, but I would, at this point, like to invite Jamie Turley from Sterling, Ohio, to come up and talk about some more real-life experiences.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jamie Turley. I live in Sterling, which is a small town in Wayne County. It's surrounded by dairy farms. And my little town only has a feed mill, a farm equipment store, a tire store, several churches, a fire department, and a hair salon. We got one small bar, and we have one small bar restaurant. And we also have a park. It's a little park, but it's where the school used to be before they tore that down. And we used to have our own post office once upon a time, but they closed that down several years ago as well. Besides that, there's nothing but dairy farms and some homes and the train tracks. So there's not a whole lot of opportunities for jobs in my town to begin with. So getting, a job anywhere, it's at least 12 to 15 miles to go to a place where there's population in stores or restaurants or places to actually find employment. So without a vehicle, that would be literally impossible where I live. I'm 52 years old and I have 3 grown sons. They're 32, 29, and 22 years old. My husband passed away in 2012. Sorry. From complications of diabetes. He was only 42 years old. I didn't expect this to happen, I'm sorry. Our youngest son was only 13 when he passed, and he's also type 1 diabetic, diagnosed only 3 years ago. And he still lives with me, and he's currently unemployed, and so am I at this time. So we're both looking for employment, and like I said, that would be impossible to do without having some type of vehicle where we live, unless you work on a dairy farm in the surrounding area, which we have both done. Both of us have done that. And so if they change this and put in an asset test to where the vehicle would be counted as an asset in the use of Blue Book value, my Jeep right now would make me ineligible only by $280, I think it would be, that would make me ineligible. So, like, you can't win for trying, basically, and they have to make it easier for people who really do want to work and are trying real hard to get out of their situation, to get out of that situation. You can't make it harder for us to get out of the situation. It just makes it worse, and we're never going to get anywhere. And especially when you have something like diabetes going on. And I know I'm not the only family that struggles with a situation like this in Ohio. I see it all the time. I have Facebook groups that I see it all the time. It's not just me. So if you really want to do something for the real working people of Ohio, you should actually start talking to the real working people of Ohio like me, who do the jobs, that work in the restaurants, that milk the cows, that, you know, do the things that other people don't want to do. I don't want to say that everybody doesn't want to do that, but you know what I mean. And find out how hard it is to really have to go ask for assistance and provide all the things and do all the things they require you to do to get assistance. I don't want to be on assistance. I love to be self-sufficient. I love to be able to pay for all my son's medicine and take care of her and not have to worry about any of that. That is not the situation that I have. So I've been on and off assistance for most of my adult life because of my husband's situation as well. Times when he would get sick and couldn't work and we would have to get assistance. And it's just never been an easy situation since the time he was diagnosed with diabetes, basically. And I'm still living in that situation, unfortunately. And I just really think that they need to rethink this one because my son has a car that he just wasn't running for a whole entire year. He spent $800 out of his last stimulus check to try and get it running, put all this money into it, did the work himself. Which if he didn't know how to do that, it wouldn't have never gotten done anyway. And now he got to drive it for 30 days and now the frame's cracked. So there's no fixing it. So there's $800 gone because we can't do anything with that car now except junk it. And we'll be lucky if we get $200 for it. So now we won't have a vehicle. But if they were to do an asset test with it sitting the way it is right now, it could possibly be over the amount Blue Book value for the amount of what they're trying to put in it for this, and he would be ineligible for any help. So, I mean, how can that be fair? Not have a job, have a chronic disease that can kill you if you cannot get what you need for it, and you have a car that doesn't run and you can't be eligible for help? There's something wrong with that. So, hopefully, someone will listen and start talking to people like me who actually live in this situation. You can understand maybe where we're coming from a little bit better. Thank you.
They say decisions are made by those of us who show up. And for that reason, over 60 of us showed up, wrote up, and called up members of the Senate Government Oversight and Reform Committee to outline our concerns over the provisions in Senate Bill 17. Once you are elected, you have a duty to thoughtfully consider this testimony. It's clear that that was not the case, that our voices made no difference, that not only were advocates, constituents, and facts ignored, but that minds were already made up before the committee process even began. To avoid further debate, the harmful provisions were inserted quickly into the budget in the name of welfare reform. We are in the middle of an economic emergency caused by a global pandemic where over 20,000 Ohioans have died. Hardworking Ohioans remain out of work. Hardworking Ohioans had to take significant pay cuts to stay afloat. And hardworking Ohioans remain in long food bank lines to meet their basic needs. Now is not the time for welfare reform. That makes it harder for Ohioans entitled to benefits to get them. To say that these provisions were added to protect program integrity is an egregious misrepresentation at best and deceitful to be frank. No one has ever been pro-public benefit fraud. We as advocates simply know that the people these provisions would impact the most are those most deserving of benefits: children, the elderly, the disabled, and the working poor. If lawmakers are genuinely concerned about fraud, we at Community Solutions have put out an abundance of research which includes tangible solutions to combat fraud, most of which include reducing administrative burdens on counties and caseworkers, as opposed to making it more difficult for struggling and vulnerable Ohioans to eat. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today regarding these provisions that were inserted in the last minute of our state budget. My name is Nick Bates, and I'm a deacon in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I serve as the director of the Hunger Network in Ohio. We're a statewide ecumenical network of people of faith that believe we can end hunger by addressing the root causes of poverty through advocacy. I'm pleased to be joined today by a few of my faith colleagues, Reverend Terry Williams from Orchard Hill United Church of Christ in Chillicothe, and the Reverend Brandy Slaughter, who is the Public Policy Director with the Ohio Council of Churches. As a matter of faith, we stand here today against these last-minute budget amendments that will unjustly take food off the table of hardworking Ohio families. Our faith calls us to work collaboratively to build up a world where we will all receive our daily bread. Our faith calls us to prioritize those who hunger by listening to them. Need I say more? We just heard a wonderful testimony about the realities of hunger in our state and the difficulties of those who are struggling to get by. Thank you again for your story today. The reality is poverty is difficult. Hunger is difficult. And most people who are in poverty are actually working or actively seeking work. And the reality is many of them are looking for more hours each and every week at the jobs, plural, that they have. We definitely believe that there is dignity in work. People are proud of what they produce and what they do and how they serve one another. And these amendments, in fact, punish those who are working hard to get ahead. Imagine a server at a restaurant working hard each and every day, but unable to earn enough week to week to support her family. She applies for SNAP. She qualifies. Actually, this is pretty common. Then in December, this restaurant server has a great month. A few extra tips, a few extra shifts that she picks up. She does well. She has to go in and report this change right before December hits. The holiday rush with the extra dining out and those extra glasses of wine is gone come January, and her wages fall back to normal when she needs it most. These provisions tell this person, don't work when their employer needs her to work the most, because if she does, she might then lose public assistance when she needs it the most. This is an unrealistic snapshot of 30 days at the wages of the low-wage workforce. Similarly, if we impose asset testing, are we encouraging a family to sell their car if it's valued too high? God forbid people have reliable transportation. Last I checked, you cannot eat a car, but you need it to get to work. These amendments and others seek to blame a person for having an asset that will be crucial to any effort toward economic stability. Why must we make people who are already struggling to get by struggle more? That's immoral, unethical, and frankly, it is fiscally irresponsible. Because the best solutions to poverty are to identify the assets that are already there and to build upon those. It is easier to help somebody overcome one or two barriers towards economic stability than it is to overcome multiple barriers. Last I checked, the gospel in Matthew 25 does not read, "For when I was hungry, you made me sell my car. For when I was hungry, I couldn't pick up an extra shift at work. For when I was hungry, I had to lose everything before anyone cared." That is not the gospel message that I'm aware of, but that is the message of these amendments. Today, I offer Governor DeWine and the members of the Budget Conference Committee a piece of advice and I give to my 11-year-old son this past year as I helped him with his virtual and online schoolwork. Slow down and check your work to make sure the answer makes sense. These amendments are not the answers to hunger, poverty, and program integrity for our community. These provisions ignore the abundance of testimony that was offered against Senate Bill 17. These provisions increase bureaucracy and new barriers. These provisions punish those who work. These provisions will increase hunger. In short, these provisions do not make sense for Ohio. Kids who are hungry struggle to learn. Adults who are hungry struggle to work. Seniors who are hungry struggle to stay healthy. And a state with more hunger will always struggle to succeed. Governor DeWine and members of the conference committee, please remove these provisions from our state budget. Thank you.
Once again, we are here today, and I hope you've had a little bit more of an insight from our speakers today as to why these provisions, these specific amendments that were added into the budget at the very last minute, like Nick said, do not make sense for Ohioans and will have real life implications on folks who are already struggling to get by. We want to thank you again for your time this morning, and we are open and available for questions from folks in the room or joining us virtually.
Can you talk a little bit about how this might make it more difficult? Like, what's the paperwork change if there's an asset test? Is that going to make it more difficult for people who are still eligible to go through all the?
Certainly, absolutely. So the question was for folks joining us virtually, what would be the paperwork change for folks who are processing paperwork, as well as filling out the paperwork for benefits? And we can invite Jack Freck back up to the stage to talk about what those real implications will be, both on the part of the county caseworkers and those folks who are applying.
Essentially, when we did this before, people would need to tell us, what kind of vehicle they had. We literally had a subscription to the Blue Book, folks, Kelly's Blue Book. Look up the value of the Blue Book in there. If it was over the limit, at that time it was $1,500. They weren't eligible. And they were given, I think, 30 days to trade the car down, get rid of it, trade for a lesser value car. I mean, that was essentially the process. And this, the other thing you need to know is that we also had access to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So we knew whether or not you had a car registered to you. We knew that already. So, I mean, so it's not, we have access to everything. So that's essentially the process and how that would work. Of course, presuming whenever they implement this, it would apply to any applicant or any reapplication. I'm pretty sure that's probably the way they would do it. When they review each case, they would look again at your assets. And it also includes any other assets you may have, like burial account or any other funds you may have in the bank.
Jack, you may want to stay up here. Another question from one of our folks joining us virtually. Could someone detail how the asset test would work? What would change for current SNAP recipients once they were up for their redetermination? What would the process look like?
Well, as I pretty much stated, we would be reviewing, what you claim you have in the way of a vehicle. Plus, again, we can get reports from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to see what registered vehicles are registered in your name. We would be applying the new standard as soon as it becomes effective to your eligibility. In the past, and I think the department will still need to write rules for this, and so there may be some time frame that you have in order to divest yourself of those resources. But I'm sure there will be something like that, and you will be basically told you have X amount of time to get your resources down, your assets down to the limit, which means if your vehicle is more valuable than that, then again, you'll have to trade down or get rid of it. Yes, or not get help.
Also, we wanted to clarify for those folks joining us virtually. So these new eligibility requirements would apply to folks who are currently on SNAP at their next redetermination once they're in place. So this would apply to folks who currently receive SNAP benefits pretty soon. Our next question, back to the asset test. Jack, again, thanks for being here. Does the bill use the federal asset test, which excludes vehicles for work? I think I'm gonna take a shot in the dark and say, no. This will certainly and specifically include vehicles within that asset test within the value limit, which I think is around $2,000. Close to it. It's a great one. How have asset limits in other states harmed people? Well, and as Jack said earlier, we had them they were in place in Ohio a number of years ago, and it wasn't great news for those folks. If you want to share just a few more details, Jack. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, again, you know, poor people have a hard time keeping a car on the road legally in the first place and safely. I mean, they just don't have the money. And this essentially we're taking people who had cars that were functional and making them either trade down to one that wasn't or getting rid of the vehicle altogether. And yet, you know, the food stamp program itself has a work requirement. Of course, everyone has a requirement in Southeast Ohio. You can't walk anywhere, to a grocery store, to a job, to a healthcare provider, to any of those things. You need a vehicle. And we're essentially means testing this crisis. We're taking people who already struggle to keep a vehicle on the road, and we're putting a policy in place that says, well, yeah, if you already have one, we're going to take that away. That's the reality of this policy, and that's the way it played out in Ohio in the past.
If I could just add to that, Kelsey, there are very, very, very few states that have this asset test in place. The most conservative states in our union, Oklahoma, Alabama, they don't have this asset test. This is, I believe there's 7 states total that have an asset test in place. And so the most conservative states in our country do not have this egregious asset test in place.
Oh, thank you so much for that addition. So that concludes our questions for today, and we want to thank you once more for your time. And once again, we implore our Senate leadership and members of the conference committee, there is still time left to change this. There is time left on the clock to make these changes that would, as you've heard many times today, impact those folks who are trying to get by and doing the very best they can. Thanks again for your time, and thank you again for being here.